Education's digital future has not yet been determined. We are building it now. That task raises very large questions. How do people learn best digitally? What does educational equity mean in a digital world? Who will profit in a greatly expanded market for digital educational products? And who will make the rules for this marketplace? How will quality standards for digital learning be determined and enforced? We do not pretend to have all the answers, but we are trying to ask the right questions. We know that many of the most important questions are not just technical. They implicate the politics, ethics, and indeed the very meaning of education at a new moment in the history of modernity. Over the past year, we have been joined by many voices. People from throughout Stanford have enriched our weekly class discussions. Leaders in business, government, and the global academy have joined our public forums. And highlights of this past activity are available at our website, edf.stanford.edu. And I hope that you do take a look at some of the prior material that's there. We are inheriting a year's worth of activity that many of you helped us to develop. So we are Education's Digital Future 2.0, and it's a great pleasure to be back in this room with a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new ones. Is higher education a business? Some think that the answer to this question is obviously yes. For evidence, they point to the enduring institutions of for-profit academic publishing, for-profit schools, and recent startups like Coursera, Udacity, and NovoED. They remark that higher education is routinely referred to as an industry by politicians and policy analysts. They note the extraordinary tuition prices and immaculate landscaping of places like Stanford University. Some think the answer to this question is decidedly no. For evidence, they point to the extraordinary public investment in colleges and universities in the United States since World War II, the deep commitments to national service through which colleges and universities helped the United States win the Cold War and helped the state of California nurture the economic miracle that is Silicon Valley. They note that all the tuition revenues and all of those acres of landscaping are largely exempt from state or federal government taxes. But if there is one thing that my own horribly overpriced liberal arts education taught me way back in the dark ages of the 1980s, it's that binary distinctions obscure as much as they reveal. The answer to this evening's question is almost certainly not as simple as yes or no. And to help us do what academics do best, complicate things, we have assembled four very sharp and articulate people. Linda Thor is Chancellor of the Foothill and Anza Community College District, comprising Stanford's community college neighbors in Los Altos Hills and Cupertino. Before assuming the chancellorship in 2010, Linda served for nearly 20 years as president of Rio Salado College in Tempe, Arizona, a college known for serving working adults through online learning and worksite training, and was instrumental in creating the 25-year history of online learning that Stanford and Harvard and MIT just woke up and decided they should enter. It was a chance meeting that brought John Feiber to Mohr Davidow Ventures, a venture capital firm that's headquartered virtually next door to Stanford on Sand Hill Road. Most of the investments in John's portfolio harness emerging technology. When John joined Mohr Davidow in 1991, after prior positions with the mainframe maker Amdahl Corporation and then Sun Microsystems, Silicon Valley was in the midst of a downturn. And this is a quote off the Mohr Davidow website. I love this. Quote, "The thinking was that the Japanese were going to take over the technology industry. It was thought by many that the best days of the valley were behind it." John thought otherwise, and both he and the valley are apparently still here. John is currently collaborating with Stanford faculty member and IDEO founder David Kelly on a project to creatively reimagine Stanford University in the digital era, and that's how I met John, through this project of David's in the D School, which I'm sure many of us will be hearing more about going forward. Amin Saberi is co-founder and chief executive officer of NovoED, one of the 3 platforms used by Stanford faculty to convey online courses to the rest of the world. Amin is an associate professor in the Department of Management Science and Engineering in the Engineering School at Stanford and co-director of the Social Algorithms Lab. His research has focused on the intersection of computational and social sciences. Our 4th presenter will be David Palumbo-Liu. He is the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor of Comparative Literature at Stanford, and he also is chair of the 46th Senate of the Stanford University faculty, which convenes this year. David's fields of scholarly expertise include social and cultural criticism, literary theory and criticism, East Asian and Asia-Pacific American studies. David is also a very active public intellectual and has been active in transnational discussion that's about the digitization of knowledge generally. He is the founding editor of Occasion, Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities, and blogs for Truth Out and the Boston Review. He's also a contributing editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books. David has made it a priority this year to help the Stanford faculty think hard about higher education's digital future. Linda?
Well, good evening, and I'd like to begin by thanking Mitchell Stevens for inviting me to join this panel on the most interesting topic of is higher education a business? I'm your one non-Stanford professor on the panel tonight. I believe I'm the outsider, although in earlier conversations they each felt that they were the outsider, so we'll see. So I'm not a Stanford professor. I am a practitioner. I have been a community college CEO for 27 years. 4.5 years at West Los Angeles College, as Mitchell indicated, 20 years at Rio Salado College in Phoenix, which has the largest online enrollment of any community college in the country with over 40,000 students online. And then for the last 3.5 years, I've been Chancellor of the Foothill Anza Community College District here serving the Silicon Valley. So clearly, I am in the business of higher education. Or am I in the higher education business? I'm not sure. So I decided to have a little fun with that question. So I started by looking up definitions of business. And of course, I went to that academic treasure chest, Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says a business is an organization involved in the trade of goods, services, or both to customers. Well, we provide services, but are students customers? Or maybe students actually are the raw material, and they become our product, and employers are our customers. But the definition goes on. Businesses are predominant in capitalist economies, where most of them are privately owned and administered. Well, that's not true for public higher education. But the definition concludes, businesses may also be not-for-profit, are state-owned. Well, that's us. So are we or are we not a business? So I decided to ask senior executives who serve on the Chancellor's Business and Industry Advisory Council. After all, they should know what a business looks like. So one said, higher education is absolutely a business. It produces a product, an educated worker, for a price. Its members compete against other colleges and universities for customers. And it has market segmentation, because Foothill Anza is not Stanford, whether it be by geography, price point, or target customer. But another gave me a rather heated response. That the question is even asked implies that business is a bad thing and cannot impart core values and serve the public good. This position appears to be, don't take this personally, Mitchell. This position appears to be held by people who don't necessarily share my core values and want to impose their definition of the public good on the rest of us. Many, if not most of us business people, pay considerable attention to core values because if we don't, our employees and the businesses will go elsewhere. And we don't have a deep pocket, read the taxpayers, to catch us when we fall. Whoa. So I decided to ask other community college presidents and chancellors, and you might be surprised what they said. Public colleges and universities are becoming more like educational enterprises out of necessity. We must become more entrepreneurial and operate like a business. Our survival is in jeopardy. Frankly, I think it is a good, however painful, trend. Public education should not be sacrosanct. The age of accountability and performance funding is here, and in the end, we will be better for it and the business model it drives us to. Surprised that was a college president? Well, here's what another one says. And he chose to compare and contrast for-profit higher education with public higher education, with some bias. For-profit higher ed can in fact let the almighty dollar and bottom line profit become too much of their ultimate motivation. On the other hand, they seem to gain their savings through what they pay faculty and staff and efficient business practices versus shortchanging their students or customers. If they do employ a strategy of underserving their students or sending them off with degrees underprepared for the workforce, competition in the private sector will eventually take care of the problem when they're forced out of business for lack of demand. For-profit higher ed will always be seeking just the right balance of providing what the customer wants at a price that also provides a sustainable profit. But as we all know, this is not a perfect solution either. Students, faculty, and staff will always get shortchanged somewhere along the way, while for-profit institutions are finding that perfect balance of satisfied customer and acceptable bottom line. But he goes on. Public higher education that is free of shareholders and profiteers has shown that it can be the premier vehicle for delivering the best service and quality higher education to our country's students. But at the same time, we need to find ways to improve on the accountability from public education institutions for the student outcomes that they achieve. So, I decided to ask those who are accountable. So I asked the members of my elected board of trustees whether we were a business. My board chair said, yes. In some ways, higher education is a business, an industry. However, the business of education is beginning to have cracks. Just as government has to watch spending as it can't keep increasing taxes, universities may not be able to keep balancing the budget by increasing tuition. But it may not be bad to be like a business. For example, maybe there should be some consolidation, just as in business where the weaker institutions disappear, like in the banking industry. We certainly know that at the K-12 level that we have way too many small districts. My guess is the same holds true for higher education. So, of course, the fact that I even reached out to talk to all of these constituent groups and attempted to build some consensus around the question, attest to the fact that I'm not a business CEO. I'm a leader in a shared governance process where my role is consensus building and adjudicating often competing interests of faculty and students and trustees and community and legislators. Yet I must also, at the same time, be adept at planning and budgeting and other non-academic tasks. So if higher education is a business, I think that it is a very unique business. Students don't buy a degree. At least I hope that students are not buying a degree. Students are seeking an education, but it is for a fee. And we provide that opportunity. Most of higher education does not seek to make a profit. However, we do need to bring in enough revenue to pay for our operations and our infrastructure. And so thus we do have to have a solid business plan in place, or our ability to provide quality education for our students is certainly jeopardized. College and university leaders must find a way to make higher education more affordable. That means that we have to bring down the costs. Insights from the business world, I think, can be very helpful to us in doing that. And believe it or not, I think that there's a lot for those of us in public higher education to learn from the for-profits. For-profits have demonstrated tremendous expertise in their target marketing and in innovation and in expediency. More specifically, they have become expert at identifying unserved or underserved students, student markets. They stay very close to the students. For-profits, being bottom line oriented, quickly learned that there's no point in duplicating an established system. So without the startup resources needed to construct brick and mortar campuses, many of these for-profits have been very creative in their delivery approaches. And that has allowed them to break down traditional geographic barriers that have often hindered access for students. And for-profits have demonstrated that quick response to market forces and trends are necessary. So yes, I think there's a lot that we can learn from their approach to higher education. But a word of caution. I believe that we will drive ourselves to extinction by seeking to become too much of a business enterprise with no academic values or emphasis on the public good. After all, I doubt that it is possible to extract a lot of profit from higher education without simultaneously impoverishing it. So, what have I concluded? Am I in the business of higher education or in the higher education business? Thank you very much.
I want to thank Mitchell as well for having me. It's a bit unusual as a venture capitalist to be on campus and not just be a bunch of people presenting at the end of which we're going to give away money. So that's not this evening. This is about a project I'm involved with, and the school is the context for my being here, and at the end I'll explain a little bit more about that. So I took a slightly different approach to why is that question even a part of the discussion. And there's a lot of changes happening in higher ed these days that's provoking a set of conversations, some of which we're going to have this evening. And I'm going to go through some observations sort of to provoke the discussion that hopefully we'll have as a group later. The first observation I want to make is that technology for the first time is truly disrupting the pedagogy in the university. the project we've been having at the D-School, we've had a lot of discussion with the students, and everybody wants to use the examples of how technology has disrupted the university. But in fact, what you discover is, if you look a little bit beneath the covers, that it's a continuation of how the university has basically behaved. And for the first time, we're really looking at, how do we teach people? What is the educational process? What is the unit of time? What does participation mean? And those are things more fundamental than putting your notes or your coursework or your textbook online. A PDF is interesting, but it hasn't changed the behavior of the pedagogy. And those are things that are fundamental to what's happening now. There are a whole bunch of public policy questions. Again, Mitchell could speak more thoughtfully than I could about this. But the public policy around higher education is now really in the forefront of a number of discussions. It's about economics. It's about taxpayers. It's about different stakeholders. But ultimately, what's happened is that it's now at the forefront. In California, not to politicize it, but things like Prop 13 set the stage for a different conversation 20 or 25 years later. Rightly or wrongly, we're having that conversation now. And it's a consequence of changes in public policy, attitudes towards higher education and what the role is. The spiraling expense for the customer. In my view, the customer, at least for a university, is the student. And that the students approach it, and they talk in the language of customers frequently. Students, frequently undergrads do. And the costs are spiraling, certainly to attend a university like Stanford. But across the board, the costs are spiraling. One of the stats I find most disconcerting in the cost is the cost of textbooks. I'll come back to that. But if you look statistically, textbooks have grown in cost greater than any other consumer good, any other measure. Gasoline, housing, anything you pick, textbooks have gone up something like a factor of 800% in the last 15 or 18 years. And why is that? And what's the rationale? But the cost to the customer to participate has gone up significantly. And then we're asking this question now because I think we're in a technology hype cycle. It's abating a little bit, but a year ago, all of a sudden, it's great. Online's going to solve everything. You're going to sit in front of your screen. You're going to have the same experience if you attend Stanford or Foothill or wherever you will. And that's now abating. I think we're getting to the other side of a more rational discussion that's going to be more thoughtful over a longer period of time. So now we get back to some of the same topics, which is education a business? And one of the questions I think about business is, you can immediately say a business is about for-profit, but it's also about value. And there's a set of people in the value equation of value to who. But in general, businesses deliver a value of some sort. One of the things that I'm surprised about, given where I come from, is that I hear about ROI used in the sense of university. You hear about, certainly in the popular vernacular, but students talking about return on investment, that my education's an investment. And some of that's correlated to the notion of what the cost is, but people think about it now as an investment, and who owns that investment, where the costs are borne, and whose investment, where is the burden? And the burden is clearly shifting. There are a lot more entrants in this. The system, and I'm going to touch on this in a moment, which is there are a lot more entrants and participants than there were in this discussion. So whoever their entrants were in the dialogue was 10 years ago, it's quite different now. You can have a startup, and there are startups trying to build institutions of higher education with the same sort of outcomes, which is credentials, recognized credentials, participation for fairly long periods of time. And not, although they're for-profit, they look and feel more similar to traditional institutions in addition to the for-profits. You'll have to forgive me because I come from a technology background, so I'm going to tell a technology anecdote. So when I talk to a group of engineers, I say, everybody's heard of Linux. I presume most of you or all of you have heard of that. And I ask the question, why do you think you run Linux today? It's now 2013. What do you think the origin of Linux is in the community? And the engineers inevitably sort of spiral, and they think of Linus Torvald, and they think of how it got written or created. And the argument I make to them is the reason you run Linux is because of Bell Labs' academic licensing policy some 30 years ago. And the argument I make is Bell Labs basically licensed the source code to Unix for $100 to every educational institution that applied. And it fundamentally changed the nature of software development. It changed the nature of how people viewed Unix. An entire generation, and then subsequently the majority of people, were trained around the operating system. Open systems, the notion of sharing code, the notion of collaborative work together, all came from basically that odd artifact, which was simply not intended per se as much as their license as a research institution caused that to be. So now you say, how does that relate to the university? Well, I think the greatest thing that's happening to higher education is it's being disrupted as an open system. So People are throwing content into the broader community. I can create content that's consumed by the community. If I'm a member of the academy, I have a choice. I can publish it. I can write a book. I can teach a class. I can put it online. I can decide to license it through the university. I can leave the university and create a competitive platform for content. If you look at the textbook world, there's a discussion afoot and clearly movement to do something akin to Wikipedia for textbooks. Why aren't textbooks collaboratively created? I'll pick on this. I forgive anybody who's a biologist here, but I have a hard time believing that a freshman biology textbook has really changed so substantively that edition 11 is more valuable than edition 5, and it couldn't be open sourced with a community of people and basically free. And so there's a lot of disruptive forces at work. If I'm an implied criticism, but it's not meant to be, but I look at an institution like Stanford or other institutions of higher education, and they're closed systems. They look a lot more like IBM looked 30 years ago, which is they're structured fairly narrowly. They're fairly closed. They have fairly rigid processes. They evolve very slowly. And they're fairly insular. That's, in fact, what's brought a lot of their success. But those institutions in an open system world are under enormous pressure. So what do those things mean? What does it mean to be a member of the academy? What does a credential mean? What does participation mean? And the other thing for open systems that, to me, is most provocative is I think the participants, the students, are going to have much freer choices for what it means to be taught. So one of the challenges is that in a system, I'll pick on Stanford because we're here, you don't get a lot of choices as a student today. You're going to take a class, and the teacher's going to offer the class, and it's basically a closed system. And you may have good teachers. You may have teachers that aren't as talented. But at the end, you take what's offered because it's a closed system. In an open system world, you find best of breed. The promise of open systems, which wasn't always true, was that it would be a best of breed system. Well, the answer is that the best teacher for undergraduate physics could be a man or woman buried at a college inside the United States or outside the United States. And the students are going to find that level because it's a very transparent, open world. And so to me, those kind of disruptive forces are very powerful and unique to this period of time. So I want to talk about what we're doing at Stanford for a moment. So in an odd way, at Stanford's a reaction to most of what I was talking about.
That's the name of the project.
That's the name of the project, at Stanford. And if I was more thoughtful, I'd have a URL at the bottom and a place to go, and we'll solve that problem. But the genesis at the D School was David Kelly and I were talking, and there's all this energy going into online. And our thinking was, isn't this an opportunity to reinvent what it meant to be a part of the community here? That in fact, this is not an opportunity to view that being a part of the community, attending a university for some period of time is a disadvantage. As a matter of fact, it's the greatest opportunity to reinvent what it means to be here. Because in fact, you can factor out the things that are not interesting and put all your effort into creating a unique and novel experience. And that's what at Stanford's about. We've also decided to pick a time frame that's 10 years away because we wanted to go far enough into the future that we'd relax the constraints of the next few years. And so there's a set of projects inside the D School that are largely student-led around looking at that question. And digital, to me, is, in an odd way, the greatest opportunity to reinvent the campus that's occurred for a very long period of time. There's a set of people who argue the other, that it's actually disrupting, disturbing, or replacing it. But I think that's fallacious, that in fact it's an opportunity to reinvent it. And there are other disruptive forces as well, because one of the things we've observed is that matriculating freshmen actually have a richer experience of alternative forms of technology and education than they're going to have at Stanford. So those students are going to come in and they're going to want a different experience. They're going to want to assume that that's going to extend and continue, not basically be supplanted by a more closed system. So it's quite an interesting time. The incoming students are very sophisticated about it, and there's just a richer and richer set of choices. The last thing I'll say is that one of the things that occurs in technology cycles is that you go through where there's a new platform and a new enabling technology, and everybody assumes the old way of doing things is going to come to the new platform, and that's going to be what the future looks like. But history says that what happens is that a new platform, a new set of technologies emerge, and in fact, a whole set of unanticipated applications, use cases, or experiences are created. And that's where we're at now. That's what we think is so interesting, which is it's not taking the way we used to do things and putting them online as much as looking at online as a way to disrupt the way we do things. So with that.
First of all, just look at me. I'm the outsider here. I haven't been the chancellor of a university. I haven't been the head of a faculty senate, or haven't been on a committee that rethinks to Stanford for the next 10 years. Just a faculty member. 2 years ago, the biggest thing, sort of was that I had a research group of size 3 that I ran poorly. So that's the extent of the. And let's say, since and I have not written a book about sort of college, from sort of a point of view of a sociologist. I'm sort of a computer scientist. What do I know? Higher ed is a business or not? What I can say is, sort of think about, I can tell you about how I actually came across this, how I sort of stumbled upon this. And what decisions, sort of what did I think about, so that led me to actually creating this startup that's called NovoED. Less than 2 years ago, I ran into Chuck Easley, my colleague in the Management Science and Engineering department, who wanted to teach his technology entrepreneurship course online. He had actually, he wanted to, reach out to a lot of people. He had recorded the videos, looked at a bunch of technologies. None of them were, what he wanted. Sort of was a good fit pedagogically. So we created, this, venture lab that would help students. So for an entrepreneurship course, it would help students to, sign up, form teams. Each team would be able to work on their own project, sort of work together, similar to try to create an experience that's similar to his on-campus course. The interesting thing that happened was that, sort of 80,000 people signed up for this course from all around the world, like sort of from, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley all the way to, students in Accra, Ghana, who didn't have internet access at home or at school. They would go to an internet cafe to submit their homeworks. We helped them form teams. Teams worked on various very interesting projects. The top teams, we helped them even, sort of, they found the mentors, the top 200 teams, the top 20 teams. We helped them pitch to a venture capitalist. Over a period of 4 or 5 months, they actually created something that some of these projects got funding. They became companies. They now are hiring. It was a little project that we started. Close to the end of it, it felt more like a social movement. And then after the end, actually we got a lot of, requests from inside the Stanford and outside that, hey, this is great. I want to offer my course like that. And then, sort of was like, what does it mean to offer a course like that? So then I started, sort of thinking about, so here's the working hypothesis that in this transition from brick and mortar to online learning, don't just strip away the social, experiential, or collaborative aspect of learning. Use the power of the social web to amplify this, to open new doors, to make new things happen. And I don't, I'm in the School of Education. I shouldn't, sort of advocate this. I shouldn't say why this is, sort of, it's leading to much higher engagement and retention of these courses. It's, sort of fostering, courses like this, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication skills. And these are, I argue, far more important than actually the content that we are, sort of. And, students, when they go through these courses, they actually build a network. Interesting project, like sort of, Now, the interesting thing is that close to the end of that course, there was a lot of discussion within Stanford about this, about the MOOCs and about the online movement. Actually, it was pretty much around the time that, John Mitchell was appointed as the, sort of vice provost of online learning. The office was created. So actually, sort of over the past year or so, Stanford has benefited a lot from, sort of having that leadership. Now, so that was Stanford, sort of moving that. Now, I had to think, what should I do? Should I continue this as a project within Stanford? Should I, go back to, writing my papers? Should I, go, sort of do this with, say, Coursera or edX, or start a new project, start a new startup? So why a startup? So at the time, I thought, this technology is going to be very disruptive. If you think about, the higher education, and you look at Stanford, sort of fantastic students, like if you look at, sort of every year from, sort of faculty who win, sort of Nobel Prizes to, sort of students, sort of, creating all sorts of wonderful, sort of companies and, coming up, or, winning medals in Olympics. Stanford is doing just fine. But that's not a typical experience. Like sort of, if you look at the, for lack of better word, I call it non-traditional students. A lot of people who actually need, sort of education to enrich their lives or advance in their careers, and they can't pay the, sort of kind of tuition that's needed for a 4-year or 2-year degree. They can take years off, even months off, days off to go and take this education. And sort of, sort of that's the, sort of the sector that, we can, address here. And then the technology will disrupt the traditional system. This shift is not going to make everybody happy. There will be people who will actually, sort of be, sort of, let's say, for lack of better word, losers of the transformation. Now, within a Stanford, I thought... No loser, yeah. So I thought within a Stanford, it's going to be, a lot of political pressure. And Stanford should actually take a more conservative approach when it comes to this, very naturally. So I didn't want to get to a point where they think, sort of at the, sort of, well, we like Amin, this is an interesting technology, but it's becoming actually a very, sort of... so I thought, what's the right model? And, that requires a talk on its own. But it seems to me that the right model is a, sort of public-private relationship where, sort of entities like Stanford or other universities can, mitigate their, sort of minimize their risk. Now, when you look at, sort of a startup, it can be faster, nimbler. It can attract talent, and maybe in the beginning, sort of it's the difference is small. But let's say if something is becoming actually substantially, sort of world changing, sort of you reach the company at the level of say Twitter when it goes to IPO, it's going to raise $1 billion. Now, theoretically, Stanford can also commit, that kind of money. But pragmatically, probably that's not possible. So I thought, this could be the sort of the right model. And now that sort of led to the start of the NovoED. I'm going to get into more details about, what would be the right relationship. But since I was asked to be a little bit more provocative, let me end with, sort of the, 5 predictions about the world of higher ed in 5 years. And that actually would lead to, sort of a, sort of discussion about what's the right kind of partnership. Right. So content. There are a lot of, so as you said, sort of content is going online. So one way to say this is that, be free, it's going to be commoditized. Here's another prediction. A few universities will embrace the online technology, and they grow significantly at a national and international level, and at the cost of many others. Again, I'm repeating a sort of education, simply, sort of right now is something that happens, behind closed doors. The technology will help help us open up. Data will help us measure outcome. And then, sort of, there will be a way to, sort of go beyond hype and actually have a comparison for different technologies. And here is another one. I think, education will become a major export for United States and several other countries. Already, if you look at, for example, sort of, universities in the United Kingdom, consortium of universities in Germany are thinking about creating a unified degree and export it to various countries. And now in the there is, sort of higher ed, and then if you look at another aspect like professional education, because there is less federal regulation, and there is and since actually the person who's sort of footing the bill, actually paying the money, is looking for the outcome more immediately, the disruption is going to happen much faster in professional education compared to the traditional higher education. So with this 5 predictions, I'll
Okay, well, I want to thank Mitchell for inviting me, and I also want to pass on to him the thanks of the athletic department. The question is no longer, are college sports a business? So they thank you for that. We did have a contest in terms of who the real outlier is, but I think everybody has a good case, but I win. Because I am the humanist in Silicon Valley, and I have no slides. So you can measure it from that. I'm a comparative literature professor, and I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about language and values, because that's something that's really fascinated me about this idea of online education and MOOCs in particular. At one point, I was very interested in rational choice theory because it seemed to emanate from this very parsimonious mathematical formula to describe everything that anybody would ever want to do in life. And I feel the same way about online education. A couple of years ago in the Faculty Senate, it was announced as the tsunami of the future. What an unfortunate use of words, but very vivid. So I think we have to have... What? Well, because Fukushima had just occurred. So it wasn't, the timing was bad. So I think that we have to think of a much more capacious and variegated vocabulary. I think that with what's happening these days, teaching and learning covers over so many different kinds of activities that are not the same at all, that we should think about that. And so as chair of the Faculty Senate, as Mitchell said, I decided that for the sessions that I could have some control over, we should have a really strong discussion about what online education is at Stanford. And I spent this summer getting a really thorough education, I think, about it. And everybody that I spoke to reinforced my feeling that what we're doing at Stanford is really good. It's inventive, it's thoughtful, and it thinks a lot about the public good in all sorts of ways. And it gave me something positive to think about as I was reading horrible stories in the press. For example, the firing or the near firing of the president of the University of Virginia because she wasn't doing what Stanford was doing. And I looked around and I said, what are we doing? And nobody really understood what we were doing. So it was a firing based on a phantom model. I was out at Harvard last week. I was talking to somebody who works at Harvard X, and he said, how did you guys get the provost to prohibit professors from selling their content, from not letting it be commercialized? And he said that would have taken an act of God at Harvard to do that, and this is Harvard. So I thought that we were doing something quite good. I think the talk about MOOCs has completely overshadowed all the other things that are going on in online education. I think what John mentioned in terms of at Stanford gives me a lot of hope. But let's face it, the very language of business is insinuated into education. You take out a loan. You expect an outcome. You expect some measurements of success. And there's and that's all good. But I think we should not let it become too literal. In other words, let's let it abide in a metaphorical state. And a partnership between schools of education and engineering is very rich and exciting. But the kind of learning that's best delivered at this point in development, I think, are skill-based courses. They are no doubt at the core of liberal education, but I don't think they are the core of liberal arts education. I'm going to get to that soon. The partnership has many good aspects, but it can also be embedded in some scenarios that are not optimal. And I don't know if you saw the article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed on September 23rd. Colleges join the ed tech revolution by nurturing young companies. It reads, the next so-called disruption posed to remake higher education may soon be born at a university near you. That is thanks to a growing number of colleges' creation of in-house education technology incubators that they say will turn them a profit while letting their students and faculty members in on the ground floor of the next innovation. Universities are looking to capitalize on the role they can play in familiarizing would-be innovators with the landscape of education. Many ed tech entrepreneurs have made money in successful technology startups and are looking to be part of a more mission-based operation, said Bobby Kershaw, Executive Director of Academic Innovation at Penn's School of Education and leader of its ed tech project. She says, quote, "The problem is they don't speak the language of education, and they don't understand it." And I think we should pause over that statement. What does she mean, and what is she going to afford them? The article continues, "A university can help by providing the research necessary to get an idea off the ground for a price. For faculty members at Penn's education school, for example, using their research to be a consultant for an ed tech company and thereby having a stake in the business can be a more lucrative prospect than simply publishing the work. If a business takes off under the incubator model, the school itself will get a cut of the profits." It goes on and on. I won't. You should look it up. But the last line is, "Universities must seek out ways to actively disrupt themselves," which sounds kind of rude, while also continuing to deliver the package of an education. Again, language. So what is driving what? That's my point about this Chronicle of Higher Education argument. And now I come to the main point of my presentation. And it's something that I think gets left out of the picture. I think I was glad that John mentioned the effects of Prop 13. I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that this incubational, disruptive, entrepreneurial spirit coincides with the devastating landscape of the post-2007 world, which has disrupted the picture of education more than any business could possibly do. The worsening condition of the middle class, if even that is a designation these days, and the huge stress placed on education today to fulfill its role as an engine for upward mobility. Money for education is scarce for every participant: schools, students, parents. There's a perfect storm wherein business is essential and yet might be precisely at odds with the mission of a liberal education. Now, I'm not against online education by any means. I serve on the steering committee of Haystack, which is the Humanities, Arts, Sciences, Technology Alliance, a collaboratory. This winter I'm giving, and I'll plug this course, a course that's going to be blended in and shared with Kathy Davidson at Duke and Chris Newfield at Santa Barbara, and it will be an examination of online education in a time of crisis. And we'll be sharing the classroom several times along with Howard Reingold here at Stanford. So I think we need a critical re-examination of a specifically public education. What are we doing? My concern is that the economic crash plus entrepreneurial wave plus real need to build career skills will produce a generation of students who are instrumentally driven. They will not really be getting an education, they will be acquiring a skill set. And that is, at bottom, how education can be seen as a business. Outside of the dollars, there's a basic issue of values and priorities. Most disturbing is the idea that the economic crisis and its fallout has produced conditions under which, to adapt Naomi Klein's term, administrators and state legislatures can apply a shock doctrine, opportunistically shifting values and resources away from liberal education into producing more and more quantifiable assessment positive data, improving bottom line by appearing to cut costs, effects on adjunct labor, lecturers, classrooms, facilities usage, an investment in celebrity professors, the invention and stratification of 2- or 3-tiered or firewalled kinds of education, in other words, segmenting institutions from within so the priorities become clear and others dispensed with. I'm entirely sympathetic with parents, especially of lower income, who want to see their children get good jobs. I'm sympathetic with administrators battling with inflated costs, diminished state and federal support, and students wishing to learn any number of things but feeling guilty and irresponsible for not following lucrative careers. We have all these forces pulling us seriously to think seriously of business, the business of education, but not as a system that is closed in on this sort of symbiotic relationship wherein financial profit and educational data feed off each other, but rather think of the purpose of our attention to business, the business end of things, to support not only bedrock virtues and values of a truly liberal education, which is founded on a notion of critique and self-reflection, but also in this age on learning how to use these remarkable tools in creative ways. They would not be capitalized, but rather freely shared in cooperative ways. In sum, and this is my last statement, I'm all for universities entering into successful business ventures, but they should be a means for a different end, not recapitalized back into bigger and better businesses only, but fed back into the university as a whole for the many different missions that a university has. They're less quantifiable, non-skill-based, but immeasurable in a good way. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll ask the 4 panelists to come up. And I think there's another microphone like this one. Oh, good. Ashley has one. So, and this is the room is perfect for this sort of game show town hall setup. So, whenever you have, if anyone with a comment or a question, please raise your hand. And when you ask it or make your comment, I'll ask you to stand and introduce yourself. Well, 1 and then 2. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a Pulse student here. I guess my question is more for Jonathan. You mentioned in your presentation about is education a business? Well, is it simply about for-profit or is it about value? Which I think begs the bigger question, how do we value higher education? And do you mind responding how we might go about answering that?
Well, I think I'm going to build on some things that were said. I think there are a lot of forces that are narrowing how we value higher education from my perspective, and there's a risk that it's valued along a single dimension, which is what's the economic outcome of my participating in higher education. I think if we look back deeper, it's not historically been a single-threaded discussion, but there's a lot of forces narrowing the discussion, and I think that's one of the great risks. That, if you look at the role, again, my background's in engineering, but the role of humanities inside an educational institution tests what the broader value is of the institution versus, where you could end up much more narrowly around, look, this is about a set of skills and how those skills directly translate into the workforce. So I think that's one of the big questions that has to get asked. Technology, in many cases, technology should allow you to expand the discussion, right? That in my view, technology applied properly broadens the discussion, and the risk is that technology is used here to narrow it. If you look at credentialing, if you look at testing, you could really restrict the kind of things you can do because online or certain kinds of formats of testing only lend themselves to certain types of material or dialogue or education. So it's quite. I don't know the answer to the question, but I think it's increasingly at the forefront of the discussion.
Can I actually ask the question? This is So is the argument, and I'm really trying to understand, is that technology cannot if you deliver education with technology, it won't teach students critical thinking or sort of self-reflection, or no, it's because of the market forces, people won't ask for it, so it won't be offered.
I don't think we know. And one of the things that has to evolve is technology that does a better job teaching critical things. I mean, it's just early days, but I don't think there's a known answer to that.
Yeah, I agree completely with what John just said. The problem is that people want quick measures of success. Right? And the quickest measures of success are those that are quantifiably capturable quickly, right? And I really appreciate what you're doing because you're incubating without this 9 months necessarily to roll it out, right? So with the time which Stanford affords you, you can actually ask all sorts of questions that wouldn't be able to be asked otherwise. So I hope critical thinking can be built into that. I don't see why not. Right? But right now that's not where the eyes are focused.
Right, and I think that particularly those of us in public higher education are concerned about whether you want to call it the accountability movement or the completion agenda. I mean, certainly we care about completion, but we also care about other forms of student success. And so the student who comes to us and enrolls in an automotive course in order to learn something about his transmission to repair it and then drops out met their goal and considered their experience as successful. That's a failure for us in the eyes of those who are defining success only by a limited number of measures, and I think that's a real problem.
I'd be remiss coming from the D School. I mean, the D School design thinking is largely experiential in
Right.
nature, and we don't begin to understand how that would translate to a purely online, quantitatively measured experience. As a matter of fact, honestly, we're not spending any time trying to solve that problem.
Actually, I beg to differ. Right? So one is, sort of quantitatively measured. Like, I'm getting the sense that, okay, since we're gonna, sort of go from this, what's happening in the university to this sort of, more online, it's going to be a very limited experience. Nobody is going to care about this. You will never be able to teach a design course. You will never be able to teach a course on, say, poetry online. But maybe we can. And, and it's been only a year.
That's not the core of my argument. My argument is we would need a very different set of tools and a very different set of technologies to allow that sort of collaboration. And we're just early days for them evolving. I'm not drawing a line in the sand that says it can't happen. I'm saying we're going to need a fairly large evolutions where 4 people in different locations or N people could work and collaborate in a way. And the tools today are very early and very primitive. Do I think at the end we will get there? Yeah, I don't think it's for certain no. But it's going to take a long time, meaning I don't think it's around the corner.
Right, but shouldn't then we be embracing it? If, like, sort of, it's going to take some time, we should be, working on it, right? Yeah.
I'm Louise Schneider. I'm a doctoral student here at the School of Education. I guess, I had one question, and I kind of want to ask two. So thank you all for great talks and even that little dialogue right there. These are both directed to Jonathan, but gosh, answers to everybody. What you just said was about tools for collaboration and critical thinking and so on. What's the most exciting thing you've seen recently that feels like it's headed in the right direction? Because I agree that it is a direction that we need to head in, and I think we all feel that. So if there's something that springs to mind you could answer, that would be awesome. But the other question I had was you were sort of talking about this idea that once we open up all of these materials, the best will bubble to the top. We'll find the physics teacher in Kansas, the physics teacher in India who has the explanation of thermoelectric dynamics. Can you describe as concretely as possible how you envision such a system for these materials bubbling to the top? How would that work in terms of technological infrastructure and social?
The latter, I think, is easier in that I just believe there's going to be, context and exchanges and methods for free exchange of that. You can look at things like the Khan Academy and others as sort of, first-generation experiments. But I simply think that it will come to the fore because we live in a world where there's a fairly free exchange and there's lots of mechanisms for exchange. So even today, I can self-publish, on YouTube. If it's content, I can host it. So I think it will be fairly ad hoc at the beginning. Meaning I don't think there will be a central repository, but I think there's going to be a lot of free exchange, and I think it's very efficient among the consumers of the content. And so very quickly it will bubble to the surface. We talk about virality. I'll be a bit facetious about cats doing strange things and getting 4 million hits. Well, I think the same phenomena will occur within education. If there's some professor or some individual who can explain thermodynamics better than anybody else, I think that will be quickly known to the community of consumers.
I mean, just picking up on the last statement, I was thinking of the conversation that I had with Candace, and we were thinking, let's pair a lit professor with an engineer. I mean, let's make these unexpected convergences happen. And I wouldn't be heartbroken if we couldn't teach poetry online. I mean, I don't think that should be the measure of success. I think there are all sorts of other possibilities. It might work, it may not, but I'm not going to foreclose that possibility.
And with respect to collaboration, ironically, and I suspect the others will have a broader set of experience than I have, I watched my high school student who studied in groups and never physically was proximate with the other people in the groups. The tools were phenomenally rich. It was quite interesting. At the beginning, I had to get past as a parent accusing him of not doing work. But the tools were fairly comprehensive in terms of study groups and collaborating, and it would be obvious that content would get layered in some form.
Let me just suggest that.
I apologize. The name has escaped me. But there are 2 or 3 companies that are predominant at the high school level, and there are 2 or 3 different companies that do it at the college level.
But let me suggest that you elided Emily's question, which was, I mean, it seems like your implicit answer there is we have the infrastructure that we need for the bubbling up to occur. Is that what you want to tell us?
I think it will mature over time, but I think there's sufficient infrastructure today for the content to emerge. If you have that content, I think it will find an audience.
All right, there's a cue. Yeah, here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Katie Kormanik. I'm an instructional designer at Stanford Graduate School of Business. We actually work with NovoED, and this question's mostly directed at Amin, but anyone can answer. I'm just wondering specifically, what are the most fundamental ways you've seen higher education delivery change through your experience with NovoED so far? Like, how have institutions really impacted education delivery? And really, how has the traditional university system been disrupted for students attending universities right now? And how do you think that will change in the next 5 or 10 years?
Now, for so it's actually an interesting question. I think some of the most interesting things in sort of in using online technology for enriching the experience of students is happening in a Stanford Graduate School of Business. What was the first question?
How have you seen education delivery change? What are the most fundamental ways that you've seen education delivery change for students at universities?
What's happening now? So I think one of the greatest benefits when we are like sort of working with instructors is actually looking at their course from the scratch when they sort of think about the translation online and have this sort of backward design. I think of okay, so what's the outcome that you're looking for? 1 month after the end of the course, what do you want the students to remember? What do you want them to have learned? What do you want them to have echoed? Now let's start about let's think about your last lecture, about your last assignment, and then design the course from there. I never thought about my course like that. I would show up and sort of there was a textbook and it would have would cover like 10 different topics and I would go through them, and that's never thought. All right, let's think about sort of the pedagogical model. Let's think about the experience of the students. So I would say maybe maybe the first the most important one is that opening the conversation, thinking about the design, and then sort of how the technology can help.
So is that really so disruptive, and how will that change in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, and also the disruption on campus. Sort of we are taking steps just to sort of make the to make sure that the experience of the students is, first of all, in a classroom is not transactional. They can actually continue working together on their project at the end of the course. It's not limited to the classroom. So if they have a sort of say a collaboration that's inside the classroom on the project, they can continue it smoothly outside. But the disruption, at least in my opinion, is not happening in classes of size 20. The disruption is happening when you go a little bit at a bigger scale.
I'll give you a piece of disruption. And then go ahead. You go first, Linda.
I actually want to disagree with you. And I also want to suggest that I think we may be impeding the disruption of higher education by talking about disruption. Because as soon as we start telling traditional faculty that they're being disrupted, they're going to start pushing back. Yet in reality, at least at the community college level where I work, we've had dramatic increases in the number of hybrid classes that are taught partially online, partially in person. The fastest growing segment of our enrollment, as well as enrollment in all of higher ed, is in online. I mean, our students are arriving not hoping to be disrupted. Our students are arriving wanting, to have that pathway to the middle class that they're talking about. So I think we're better off that things are changing very fast. And I think we're better off letting it just kind of evolve and grow. We ought to be talking about the evolution or the transition and not the disruption.
I'll tell you one thing that's happening at Stanford, and this is as our Vice Provost of Online Learning said this morning, Stanford faculty are using the same parts of their brains that they use for research to think about teaching. And that is a major major phenomenological shift in how teaching is understood at a place like Stanford. Mark, you want to go ahead?
My name is, this is on. Can you hear me?
Do that. Yes.
My name is Mark Krieger, and I'm a professor of international business strategy and leadership from the Royal Kingdom of Norway. So I'm a little bit of an outlier, you might say. I want to thank the esteemed panel here for their observations and thoughts. I want to be a little bit provocative, if you will. I think that you folks are missing the boat massively, with the exception, perhaps, of the two people on the ends here. And let me explain where that's coming from. A couple of observations, and based on those observations, I'll invite you to comment. First of all, a university is not, or most universities are not primarily places that pass on information and data. Ideally, it's knowledge and ultimately wisdom that I think give schools their distinctive advantage, and I think that's not really been spoken to. Secondly, the role of nonverbal behavior. As I understand it from the literature that I've studied, about 70 to 80% of communication is based on nonverbals, which is pretty thin in the medium of the internet. I say this as a former computer scientist and individual that studied artificial intelligence along the way and was in the computer field for about 10 years. I left it. I left it primarily because what I began to discover, and this is where I think the elephant in the room is not being quite spoken to, although it's alluded to by all of you. What really I think students get is access to networks, which I think you would agree to. Business schools are really good at that. But we as professionals give that when we teach, massively. But in addition, we give something else, which is happening in this room, and I think is sort of a disproof of what is a fear on the part of this esteemed university. That is role modeling. There's role modeling taking place by all of you. That process, to me, in terms of the education that I received, was absolutely crucial. I don't think that the Harvards and the MITs and the Berkeleys and the Stanfords will be disrupted except at the margins. The schools that will be disrupted are the schools that are passing on primarily codifiable knowledge. It's that tacit knowledge that I think if you're going to do digital education, that's where I believe, and this is where I'm going to push you, how do you pass on tacit knowledge in a medium that is rather unidimensional at best? Hand it back.
I disagree with you. So I disagree with you. You are not giving this medium enough credit. You can actually do quite a bit. We are at earlier stages, but these are happening at Stanford. With the continuing studies, we are developing a course on novel writing, on writing novels. We offered a few courses on creativity that were extremely successful. Just look at what the students have produced. They did it in, sort of together in teams. They learned from each other. They were role models from each other. We asked them, what did you learn at the end of this online class? And they, of course they said, oh, lectures were great, but they said, I learned how to work in a team. I learned how to negotiate my role in a team. I learned how to manage a team virtually. I got to know these 5 people that I did not know before, and they live on the other side of the earth. Don't underestimate the power of the internet. Just go take a look at GitHub and see sort of how people are sort of coming up with sort of building on each other's work, learning from each other, and building a network. Look at the internet. It's creating an experience richer than a university.
See, I think you're
Yeah. So I'll step into this, for better or worse. I think that what gets I think there's the fallacy of efficiency that gets brought up when there's technology. So I'll accept that I'll argue that over time the technology will allow the kind of human interaction you're describing, but it won't scale. My issue is that there's this fallacy of efficiency when we talk about online, that somehow magically the technology is going to allow us at significantly diminished cost to offer an equivalently rich experience. And I don't necessarily, having been in AI, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think the technology could offer some of the same richness, but to me the challenge is that it won't necessarily scale because the human cost won't be nonlinear at the same rate. Does that make sense? So I think you can get there, but it won't necessarily be for 10,000 people at the end of a pipe. And so, but I could describe to you an experience for handfuls of people to interact that would ultimately be just as rich.
Look at the language you used. Universities create networks. I mean, this is where the metaphorical slippage is very interesting, a virtual community. How thick or thin can it be? I think we have to look at it in very discrete ways. There are instances online communities are incredibly rich and collaborative and thicker than if I was sitting next to you not talking to you or commenting on the weather. On the other hand, I can imagine being in a classroom, there's a thunderstorm, there's a unique experience going on in that class. So I think we have to parse these things out carefully and also to wonder about how language wanders through these different sites, seeming to say the same thing when actually they're very different phenomena.
First, we're making the assumption that all online courses are going to be MOOCs, that they're going to be these thousands of people. And in my world, online courses have 25, 35, 40 students max. And the faculty members report to me that their interaction with students is 2 to 3 times what it is in person. And the student experience, for one thing, the student can't sit in the back row back there and go all the way through the term without ever participating. They've got to participate. And the students perceive the responses that they're getting back from faculty members, even if that faculty member happens to be using a rubric, that they've gotten a very personalized approach and they've gotten a lot of feedback. So I think that the student experience may actually be quite different than what you're describing. They feel that it's more personal and that they know the faculty member better than they would in a different, in a traditional face-to-face.
Here.
Joyshi from the business school. In MOOCs right now, it seems like the people who are engaged in the MOOCs are really engaged up until the very end. The attrition rates are extremely high, and so it seems like a lot of online learning right now is best only for the most motivated of people. As that evolves, how do you see the other people getting drawn in?
That's for you.
I'm dominating this. So no, that's a good question. But I would say this applies to the first generation of massive open online courses. That you just put the content online is sort of, it was, clearly sort of focused on the most boring part of the education, talking head and multiple choice questions. We are getting better at it. We have this project, for example, with the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching to take Quantway and Statway online, and these are remedial math courses. And they have been studying this, sort of question of, well, why is the completion rate so low? And these are in, brick and mortar classes. And the first question is mindset, because a lot of the students who are taking these courses think, you have to be a math person to get this, and they think they are not a math person. So actually, in the beginning of this online course, the very first lectures and assignments are about the mindset and about changing mindset. We are going to continue to work in that direction, and we're going to try to make it more engaging and more interesting. But also at the same time, I should say there will be a transition from MOOCs to other. So there should be some form of scalability, but I don't think MOOCs, like let's say one of those predictions in 5 years, MOOCs are going to be around, but they're not going to be the main delivery for offering education.
So I've wanted to find a way to make this point, and you've asked the question, so thank you. I don't think it's a platform problem at all. I think it's fundamentally a content problem. And the challenge in when this conversation comes up is we too quickly devolve to the platforms which are necessary but not sufficient. I think it's fundamentally a content problem. And if you look historically in other forms, it's great content that drives it, not great platforms. And so to me, the issue around MOOCs and whatnot is this is in mass, it's very poor first-generation content. That's my point of before. It's been repurposed from the old platform and being taught from the old form onto the new platform. That's just not going to be what's going to be successful. And one of the problems here is the great content is going to be very expensive to create, either in dollars or time. And it's true in other forms, right? When a video game costs $50 million to create that level of engagement, who believes that great education doesn't require that level of engagement? And so that, to me, is the driving force, and you'll see that. And that will take longer than the platforms and be more costly and more time-consumptive. But that will be what changes the experience, not the platform. The platform should be opaque to you or transparent, depending how you view it.
Right. It will be a bundling. It will be actually harder to, sort of draw the line and say, here's the platform, here's the content.
But
Roman?
So hello, my name's Roman. I'm a public policy undergrad here. And this question and comment is more directed for you, Linda. I thought it was really interesting that you started out your talk by saying that you are a CEO in the community college world. And so just considering your identification as a CEO and kind of background with that, I'm wondering if you can address how you envision community colleges changing going forward, particularly thinking about that if a lot of courses do start moving online, what's going to be the relevance of community colleges if students could easily just opt to take an online course that might be offered by a university professor that they might see as better but isn't necessarily affiliated with someone in the community college?
Thank you. That's a great question. It's probably actually not community colleges that I think are most in jeopardy of survival. It's those institutions that are serving the already very capable academically students, those that can participate in a MOOC and get success out of it. The students who are primarily coming to community colleges are first-generation college goers. They're students who are underprepared, students who don't have the role models we're talking about, aren't very clear about pathways that are available to them. So even in flipped classrooms in which we are having them, watch videos, they still really need the TLC of faculty and staff on campuses and the opportunity to socialize and network and those kinds of things. So will we change how we're delivering education? Absolutely. Will we still exist 25 years from now? I'm pretty confident we will.
My name is Nick. I'm a student at the Stanford GSB. Also an undergrad here, so I've spent a lot of time on Stanford. Big fan of the school, but I have to say, when you look at kind of the cost of university, a lot of the real value of it seems to be the network, the signaling effects, things that really inherently aren't that expensive or shouldn't be that expensive. To get a great group of people together, to things like brand, right? But I guess I wonder, I don't see it necessarily from these massively open online courses, a way to really signal yourself to a hiring manager. But at the same time, from these big universities, I don't see why it needs to cost so much to when those things are the things that you really value. And I'd love to hear just your thoughts on both ends of that.
The third rail.
So actually, I think you put this very well. Now, the MOOCs have been about being very inclusive, right? So when you are very inclusive, you can, have that signal. Now, we see some of those, like sort of, we have these competitions and, sort of they have teams, competing. And now we see already on LinkedIn, people say, on NovoED course, say X, we were in team 1, 2, or 3 among like 50,000 people. So we ended up being the first or second team. So people are trying to generate this, sort of micro-credentialing and moving in outside to other social. About the cost of college, why, I shouldn't get into it. There are people who have written books about it, so I'll stay out of it.
I will say, one thing I would add, though, is that physical co-presence is extraordinarily expensive. I mean, if you think about the opportunity costs that have been paid for all of us to be sitting in this room at the same time, that is we could calculate that cost, but it's huge. So, just creating conditions under which people can routinely, coincidentally bump into each other is a very, very hefty investment. Gentleman up front, stand up and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Trace Erden. I work at Wells Fargo Securities. I am equity research analyst covering education. That would be for-profit education, so I'm sort of the handmaiden to the devil. Anyway, my question was, I wanted to ask, go back to this issue of content that's sort of open and sourced from a variety of places. Jonathan, your point about an open system. It strikes me that technologically that's not a really complicated idea, but that the principal barriers to that today really have to do with the governance system of the university, right? This idea that we have accreditation, we have standards, Stanford won't accept a Stanford MOOC for credit because it's not worthy. So I'd love to hear both from David and Jonathan on this question of do you get into those conversations with the provost? I mean, are you really sort of having that conversation about, well, one day maybe we're going to want a physics class from the University of Iowa. What do you think? Or am I off target here?
Well, so there's one thing you said that I don't sort of take as a supposition. I don't think the great content's necessarily coming from within the university. So
my point even more.
So I think the great content will be created, and in the fullness of time, much of it will come outside of the formal university system. I get back to, there could be a gifted physics teacher who teaches, junior high, who does a great class for somebody and has always wanted to teach, quantum mechanics and had the skills. So I think the content in the fullness of time will come from a variety of places. The university is wrestling with the policy issues around content. I won't speak to that at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, President Hennessy has been very clear about this. Quality control, the Stanford name, and that comes before anything. So that automatically sets kind of firewall against the kinds of things that you're talking about, and it'll be.
There you go.
Yeah.
We have. I'm going to take time for two more questions or comments from two students in Education 355X. So first, Jesse.
My name is Jesse, and I'm in the Learning Design and Technology program here at the Graduate School of Education. And my question is going back to the idea of business and customer or consumer model. If we'll entertain for a moment that students are the consumers, to what extent do each of you think that these students ought to be involved in either crowdsourcing or participatory design model of being involved in the product that we're developing? I think I have some idea, Jonathan's opinion, being in the at Stanford class also, that they should be very, very involved. But I'm wondering if anyone else has something to say on that.
Well, yeah, I think they should be very involved, but there's got to be a control mechanism too, right? That's my compromise. In other words, I do want my students, because otherwise it seems so top-down. The right answer resides here, and they have to struggle to figure out what the hell it is, right? So I'd like them to look at a process in which they're learning together collaboratively, but ultimately they're paying. Again, it gets back to the consumer model. They're paying me to make a judgment, which I'm happy to do.
I would, first you might be surprised, given my remarks, that I do think students are customers. And in fact, the vision of Rio Salado, where I spent 20 years, is that we astonish our customers, which was controversial some 15 years ago when we announced that vision. But I believe that students are customers because they have choices and they can vote with their feet. And so it's important that this is D-school stuff, but that we identify what it is the customer is trying to accomplish and make sure that we assist them in getting there. That said, typically, at least again at the community college level, students arrive at our doors not too clear about where it is that they need to go. So part of what they're paying for is for us to provide that guidance to them. Now, as you get up into grad school and so on, I can see that you have a much more sophisticated customer who probably can actively participate in the design of their learning.
And in fact, we expect them to do that. Mm-hmm. That's what graduate school is largely about.
But how much choice do students have? I mean, we have breadth requirements. I mean,
right.
And they're often unwilling consumers.
Right.
So I think that
right.
that
right.
setting has to be.
Yeah. So actually, universities, especially like 4-year universities, are regional monopolies. If we think about customers, and they act like one. You got to come spend 4 years and take the courses in the order we tell you, and at the end you're gonna get this degree, and you have to pay so much money, right? I think that sort of one part of this technology is going to disrupt is going to be a great unbundling, and that's going to give a lot more agency to the consumer, to the students, to be able to pick and choose.
Yeah, so my name is Josh, and in addition to being a student in the School of Education, I'm a law student here, and so piggybacking on that question about consumers, one thing that law schools have looked at is the time frame that it takes to graduate, with the president even saying that law school should be 2 years instead of 3 years. With the spatial disruptions that we've been talking about, there are also temporal disruptions in place. Do you see in the upcoming years temporal disruptions with regard to disrupting the norm that school for a bachelor's degree, for example, should be 4 years? Because different universities have experimented with shortening the time frame or expanding the time frame, and students as consumers have oftentimes demanded that.
So I'll make one point, and it actually ties to your question. There's a lot of work beginning to go on the unit. Turns out, I won't bore you with the story, but the unit has been around for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. Well, if you start to redefine the unit, then there's all sorts of consequences to both the questions.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so people are looking at that, and that will, I think the temporal issue is a significant issue going on, but it needs to get sort of unwrapped by looking at sort of, in my view, the atomic element of that, and then rethinking what it means to get a degree in X or to participate in some other form.
Yeah, I mean, especially at Stanford, how many units it takes to graduate from engineering? I mean, that's not going to ever get short. In fact, at one point, the provost suggested it be a 5-year degree.
But if the units had a different granularity, then it would start to have a big effect.
Yeah.